Thank you, Chanel. And thank you to David Haskin and the ConocoPhillips group as well for giving us the opportunity to share our story and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. As Chanel mentioned, I do have a technical background in chemical engineering, and I've been working in the space of CO2 utilization for the last 3 or 4 years. And what I'd like to start with is scoping out the problem. We emitted about 30 billion tons of CO2 every year for the last decade. And by 2025, these emissions are expected to go up to 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. And to give you an idea, that is over 100 times the weight of every human being on the planet. So when I think about that, I think that we're emitting into the atmosphere 100 times more than the weight of every single human being. And that's a constant thing. So even as population grows, that trend seems to continue. And there's a general image of us holding the world in the palms of our hands and caring for it. But the image that comes to my mind when I think of the scope of our emissions, I think more of Atlas holding the weight of the world. Because we're making our world heavier. This emission is staying in the atmosphere, whether it's greenhouse gas equivalent like methane or CO2 emissions primarily. They're staying in the atmosphere for prolonged periods of time, 80 years and longer. And what that means is it has a generational effect on how our climate is seen by people that come in after us. And so I wanted to let that sink in for a second because it's definitely not a problem that can be solved in the next 10 years. And there has to be a long-term perspective that needs to be applied when you look at a problem of that magnitude. Even to get humanity to collectively reduce their weight by 1% in a year with weight loss reduction programs would be quite a significant ordeal. So imagine working with a magnitude of emission that's 100 times that. I also wanted to take a more contextual approach to sustainability in general. So the picture that you see here is an aqueduct that's installed in the south of France by the Romans over 4,000 years ago. And what you see here is basically an antiquated derelict of the past. It's definitely not the full aqueduct. It's less than 10% of it is still even remotely intact. And I wanted to ask people in the audience, like, when you think of that, something that's that old, and this is a yes or no question, would you usually put that down to savages or people breaking it down over the years, like just looting that place? Is that a thought that would cross your mind, that that's the reason most of it doesn't exist? Like, can you put your hands up if you think generally that's the reason there's only so much of it here, or would you put it down to some other reason? You would put it down to that. Not sure if yeah, so it's interesting. I'd be curious through Q&As to see what everyone thinks. Why is only 5% of that aqueduct still on the ground? Because my first impression when I visited this place a year and a half ago was that the south of France has seen a lot of invasions over the years. The Gauls, the Huns, maybe it was one of them that just ransacked the place. But what's interesting is this was actually taken apart in a very methodical way. In fact, if you look into the history of it, the rest of this big construction project for 4,000 years ago was actually recycled to build cities around this place. So cities of Ailes and cities of Marseille still have vestiges that came from the construction material that was used here. And so to me, when we think about recycling as a new thing, it doesn't sound so new when you read a story like that. I had to Google this on site. Like they didn't even really have that on the description. And so recycling is not just a way of using modern materials and reusing them for the purpose that they were designed for. It's about reusing things that could have been around for a long period of time. And I think that's an attitude shift. And it's interesting that even millennia later, humanity is still coming to grips with how to incorporate that in our life around the world. I also wanted to bring up something similar to the carbon cycle. So I talked about the amount of emissions that we put into the air. We put in over 50 times of that amount of water in the air just through anthropogenic sources. And that is something even climate change deniers won't deny, because a lot of times you can see the steam going up stacks of natural gas. In this instance, the reason it doesn't become as much of a threat is because the Mother Nature has an excellent way of recycling that water. That water comes back as rain, it comes back as snow, as we've seen over the last few weeks. And a lot of times it just makes its way down to the atmosphere, to the biosphere, and helps life go on. It's a very well-maintained cycle, and it's actually a cycle that seems to be resilient. As we put more water into the air, it tends to come back more. And what's happened with climate change recently is the rates at which like water emissions or water in the atmosphere has come down has been rapid. So you've seen flash flooding, you've seen rises in local sea levels or rivers and things like that. But generally, it's a well-calibrated global cycle that, despite a lot of development, which is anthropogenic primarily, it hasn't had a huge impact on how well we can recycle that water and reuse it. Contrast that to the carbon cycle. And so the 100 billion or the 30 billion tons of CO2 that we put out, much of it is not being put back in to the ground, or it's not raining CO2 anywhere. Generally, the emissions that we're creating, whether they're human or whether it's the soil releasing methane, that CO2 is actually staying in the atmosphere. It's a stable molecule, as some of you from a chemistry background will know. So there isn't a chemical mechanism through which it degrades and comes back. And for the most part, even the techniques that we talk about at scale, like carbon capture and storage, for example, using this in EOR, enhanced oil recovery techniques, or burying it underground in saline aquifers just for the sake of storage, they're very geography-specific solutions for what is ultimately a very global problem. There's many countries around the world, including Canada, China, the Netherlands, that have invested huge amounts of money. And it's funny, the US doesn't get as much credit for CCS, but they've actually done an excellent amount of work in CCS as well, both for actually using it to drive up oil production as well as just to store it for the sake of storage. There are some great projects in Texas as well as in Oregon that talk to that. But in each instance, the overall overarching conclusion has always been that if you don't have the right place to store this at the right volume, and you haven't got a progressive government that's interested in putting taxpayer money into that hole proverbially, there isn't much of an interest in trying that. EOR makes sense, and there are some viable enhanced oil recovery projects funded by the oil and gas industry that are moving forward. But for the most part, carbon capture and storage has been one of the big victims of the mortgage crisis, because since about 2010, pretty much every country in the world has said, we're not just going to store carbon for storing's sake. That might change over time, but as of right now, a much more effective and prevalent approach is the kind of approach that a previous IRIS speaker, Amory Lovins, and his group has taken. So the Rocky Mountain Institute has advocated for a long period of time that the issue isn't how much CO2 we're creating. At least it's not the only issue. As important is our demand for what creates the CO2 in the first place, so our demand for energy. So if we can reduce our demand on a per capita basis of how much energy we use, that will have a significant impact in how much energy we then produce, because it'll respond to that reduction in demand. And so in that case, LED bulbs tend to be kind of the symbol of energy efficiency, but it spans much broader than that. There's industrial energy efficiencies, there's energy efficiencies with water systems. Local municipalities across the US, we learned recently, have been separating, for example, sewer drainage with stormwater drainage, because sewer drainage is very corrosive, it needs to be processed, whereas stormwater is generally benign and can be discharged like gray water. And just making that shift alone has reduced the load on municipal water systems in states like Oregon and Florida by over 50%. That is an important, significant reduction, because that means the energy consumed by us taking a shower with the same amount of water every day is now much lower from a municipal standpoint. They're spending less energy to process that water because they're separating it from other sources. So efficiency takes a lot of different forms. And I think one of the takeaway messages that I hope I leave you with today is to provoke some interesting thoughts about why are these two different approaches, one of directly tackling the CO2, which tends to create some issues, and why is the energy efficiency issue looked at two different disparate ways, and is there a way of bridging them? Because my opinion is that we can use some principal lessons from the past to actually not only capture CO2, but also make society more efficient. And in my opinion, the way human evolution has worked since the 1800s, since the advent of the industrial age, we're working towards that premise. And I'll talk a little bit about that here. The industrial age currently, especially with a lot of millennials, I think there's an overarching narrative that we've been left behind with a world that's distressed, and it's all other people's fault who are after short-term profits, and they didn't really care about future generations. But I think a more nuanced and holistic view would suggest that the industrial age is actually one of the most important and empowering times of the last 500 or maybe even 1,000 years, because it has made common access to knowledge, access to resources. It has really created a level playing ground like history has never seen before. There's a reason, I'm sure in our crowd here today, many of us come from very, very different backgrounds. I grew up in another part of the world entirely, almost exactly on the other side of the world. And so the fact that we're all sitting here today is a product of the industrial age. It wasn't just, the children that died out of smog in London, which tends to be kind of the horror image that we see. It was also the access to clothing, the access to television and technologies that otherwise would never have been scalable if not for the power of the industry that was brought in after the steam engine. What it organically led to is an unclosed loop. So it created this economy where we got used to using things, and it was generally more expensive, and it still is today for the most part, to repair things than it is to just buy a new one. And so what that means is every time we buy a new phone or a new washing machine or a new bulb, that debris or that vestige of the past ends up in a landfill or some kind of an incinerator or somewhere where it's not really looked at as an opportunity, but it's rather looked at as just something that's a cost of doing business. If I'm Dell and I'm making new laptops and I'm getting Best Buy to charge you an extra over-the-counter fee when you buy a new laptop, I'm not doing that because I feel I can use that technology from 10 years ago to make a new type of machine. I'm doing that because that's the cost of doing business. And so we internalize that cost, and luckily there's enough margin in this world that's improving constantly to accommodate that. There isn't a lot of economic pressure on a company that's making new cars or new machines to really recycle for economic reasons. Generally, all of that comes in for regulatory reasons. And most of that is scattered. There's some regulatory jurisdictions like California, for example, or BC here in Canada that tend to be more progressive than others. And then there's parts of the world where regulation is not defined in the municipal structure. And so recycling has been looked at as a way of closing that loop. Plastics are the prime example, and that's the reason I had a facility here which sorts paper and electronic parts into plastics and other things, and usually paper and plastics have some sense of global adoption as recyclable materials, and that's why we see Starbucks cup sleeves that say they're X% bio or post-consumer used, and we see a lot of plastics like polyethylene and polypropylene that are being reprocessed and reused in massive amounts around the world. I don't think, though, that that's the end of our journey, because ultimately I think a good analog for where we need to go comes from the human labor force, because the skills that we learned in the 80s or 70s, or let's go back to the 1920s in terms of how do you become a useful worker in the workforce, they have changed a lot. And they have, I guess, nudged people to reskill themselves and become more relevant to how things are done in their current way of business. So my company has two partners that are both in their 60s, and they had to learn how to start using a laptop to send emails instead of always calling people. I was just in Louisiana a couple of days ago, and they're still rounding dial phones that they use. And they had to switch from that right to an iPhone and start messaging people and start doing webinars. And so that was a very interesting example to me of how people have upcycled their experience and their skills to be relevant to how business is done today. I don't know if anyone's watched The Office here, but one episode comes to mind where Michael Scott takes gift bags to all his clients asking them to change, but he says, there's no way we'd switch because you're not competitive in how things are done. And I think, although that's a funny example, I think there's a very systemic relevance of the lesson that was being portrayed there, which is that unless we upscale, unless we do things better, not just do what we've always done better by incrementally doing it better, but unless we get used to different ways of doing things, we run a strong risk of being irrelevant in the future. And so what I want to talk about is this whole notion of recycling. You know, there's some people that believe that if we took all of the excess steel that goes into the landfill, or the plastics or the paper, and we recycled all of it, and it came back to being the paper and the plastic, we'd be in a perfect world, we'd have solved the problems, and no one would have to drill and, you know, at least not mine for steel and things like that. And my belief is that that is a short-sighted view, and recycling is only a step of what the future requires of us. And what I'll talk about on this slide here is our vision as a company. So when we started 3 years ago, our vision was that you can not only move away from recycling to what we call upcycling, meaning use a plastic that was used as a garbage bag or as a grocery bag at a superstore, but actually use it for a better purpose in a second life. Use it for something that's more valuable than it was in its first life. And we believe that you can achieve that upcycling through the use of CO2 to create what we think would be a greener world. And I'd love to answer more technical questions if you guys have any about how we do this, but I'll talk about some of the examples where we've seen commercial traction from clients in terms of what we have produced by using CO2 and waste material, and how that's being looked at and in some cases already being adopted by industry. So the very first I talk about is a corrosion coating lining. So what we found about 2.5 years ago, very early into the conception of the company, is we were approached by a company down in the States to come up with a cost-effective coating that they could apply on industrial tanks that hold waste. And what they were finding is that these tanks would have maybe a 3 to 4 year life, generally because the bacteria that the waste held would corrode and eat through the concrete that was holding all of this water. And what that would do then is create integrity issues that would pass down all the way down through the sewage system. And so ultimately, it was wreaking havoc on the taxpayers' infrastructure, and it was identified by the municipality that that's an area of improvement that they need a solution for. In that particular instance, we found that the technology that we have come up with creates a material that can be applied as a coating on these tanks to prolong the life of those tanks from 3 to 5 years to over 30 years. In fact, all the sales that we've done so far in the US, in Oregon, and in Florida, we've offered a 30-year warranty on that product because we believe that's how long, if this product is taken care of, you'll prolong the life of that piece of capital expenditure by over 10-folds. In that instance, it's important to note that as much as CO2 is a part of our vision and our drive for doing this, the end user only cares about the value of that coating. They couldn't care less whether that had CO2 in it or not. And so that has a couple of interesting, I guess, lessons for us that I'll talk about in a bit. But another example that we've seen is with plastic composites. Plastics are some of the most abundantly produced human materials in the world. And what we found is that by using our carbon material that comes out of CO2, plastic manufacturers or plastic part manufacturers can increase the productivity of their plant by over 10%. And again, that has an immediate CO2 impact, even apart from the CO2 that we sequester in our carbon, because that increase in efficiency at producing plastic pipe directly translates to lower emissions from that industry. We've seen in concrete, in fact, we have a government-funded project going on here in Calgary, where we've shown that if we take residues from coal power plants, generally fly ash, which is residue that doesn't burn and just gets collected in tailings, if we run that through our process to capture CO2, we can increase the strength of the concrete that goes into building structures by over 30%. And when you run the economics on that, the cost of that extra processing and the actual cost of concrete, which is a very commoditized, highly competitive product around the world, there is a potential economic driver here that goes beyond just the CO2 emission benefits that some of the larger companies like Lafarge and Lehigh tend to see as part of their strategic plan. So what we're proud of in many of these instances is that it doesn't just make sense for the companies with massive balance sheets that are looking at a 10-year horizon. This makes sense for companies that are looking to increase their competitiveness in the world today. And that, to us, is an important lesson that any clean tech entrepreneur or company needs to learn, is that there are different drivers, and we need to be competitive and make a credible case to each of them. I'll just end with two other ones, which are a bit more, I guess, off off the beaten path in a sense. We found that we can make adhesives more reliable. So we've been working with a couple of companies that are in the field of adhesives, and we found that this CO2 sequestered material can actually make your glues hold longer. And probably the most surprising for us has been the pharmaceutical space. We found that the nanomaterials that we derive from CO2 can actually be loaded up with cancer drugs like doxorubicin or Gleevec and increase the efficiency at which that drug can target cancerous cells in the human body. So you can target them more effectively, and you can carry more drug to that cell more effectively, which in turn means that potentially, we're only 2 years into this, and for pharma that's not very long, but what the initial results show is that this could potentially create a family of nanoparticle-induced medicine, which in itself is a growing area, even outside of our work, to produce a range of medicine that may not be possible today. And to us, this is, and all of these examples are an example of that aqueduct from Pont de Garde. This is where we think we're not only using that approach of capturing CO2 from the air, doing something to close that CO2 cycle that currently grows unabated, but we're also creating a more efficient society that ultimately we believe is going to help us reduce our demand and also take care of the CO2 supply that we generate. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the principles that we've seen. And generally, when you talk about entrepreneurship, I think one of the ideas that's been romanticized a lot is the importance of ideas. And that, you're in your garage. Usually in the States, the idea is that you're in a garage. Elsewhere, you're in a lab that's being funded by a multi-billion-dollar company. But there's this idea that you come up with this thing and people are going to take it over, and in 10 years, something grows well. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what we have seen in our short history of 3.5 years. What we've seen is the idea is definitely the start. It's where things are conceived, and there's a huge process that needs to follow from that to create a sustainable range of developments that can move the industry forward. And so unless that idea is followed up with some kind of a prototype where this idea is put into reality and tested, the idea tends not to carry a lot of weight. There are many statistics about the waste that's created by R&D or the waste that's created by startups, because over 70% of them tend to fail across the world. But in my opinion, much of that happens at this very critical step of how do you take that ideation stage over to a prototype stage, and then to a stage where you actually test the prototype in an environment which reflects what is going to be used, what the end environment is going to be. So if you're not able to replicate the real life conditions in which, for example, our concrete will be used or some new CO2 related biofuel that you've come up with, you'll be set back by a few years because a lot of the assumptions that your work was grounded on may or may not be true. And so I think it is the onus of not only an inventor or an entrepreneur, but also the system as a whole to help that happen quickly. Because the longer that takes, the longer this research and development is going to meander. And more often than not, the longer you go before market traction, you tend to have failure. There also needs to be a lot of focus on measuring. I think there are a lot of times where the key metrics around whether something is a success or a failure tend to get swayed by what you hear. In the startup space, even outside of clean technology, one of the biggest things that tends to be a swayer is your valuation. So as a company, you're always trying to do a bigger raise than you did the last. And many times companies have done 3 or 4 rounds of raises without any commercial traction, and that is not an effective metric to figure out if you've actually cracked a certain problem. And so that is a key stumbling block that I think systemically has not been looked at well, both in Canada as well as around the world. But I think that there are some initiatives that are moving forward in that direction and making that a more important metric around market adoption and market discovery. I think the Creative Destruction Labs, which has just come to Calgary through the University of Calgary and Haskayne, is an excellent example of where the fellows that are helping the companies are tying market discovery and understanding of the market with valuation. That's not happening as well as it should, but it's good to see that there's progress there. And again, what do you find out? I think a lot of times with any endeavor, I think humility is an important part of the experience. And a lot of times with the measuring and the testing that you've done, you realize that you're completely wrong. And so if the system allows the entrepreneur, and if the entrepreneur allows him or herself to adapt and pivot to see what the new reality they see is, that is where measuring and analysis is important, because if you can't identify the important trends that will ultimately be the key drivers for your business, whether it be a recycling business, an upcycling business, or a traditional energy business, that can definitely create a risk that needs to be mitigated in other ways. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is iteration. I think, especially in the research sphere, what we've seen, we worked with over 14 universities on specific projects around market adoption of the nanoparticles that we produce from CO2. And in each case, what we've seen is that generally research tends to produce more research. And so you never have a final answer, because you can always have done something better. And that's great. And you should keep doing that. And that should absolutely be a primary goal of any company that's in an innovative field, to stay competitive long term. But that also means that the onus is on the management team to figure out what the minimum viable product is for the industry. Because if you can iterate that while you're creating revenue with your first version of the product, that puts you in a much more sustainable position than would be the case if you just kept iterating in the lab and ran out of government grants or private money to keep you afloat. And I think what has also been interesting from a generational standpoint is the importance of collaboration in all of this. My dad has been in the petroleum sector for over 35 years, in fact, for almost 40 years, and he's worked in different parts of the world. And one of the things that he's always seen in his sphere is that in the past, generally, at least in his industry, he felt that the R&D was very siloed. You could get all the experts that you needed under one place, you could get them all under your payroll, and they would come up with excellent techniques to help you produce better or refine better. What's happened with the modern age, like since the late 90s, is the problems that we've been dealing with have become very complex and very multifaceted. So you don't just need a reservoir engineer anymore. You need a material scientist. You need general physicists. Sometimes you need people that know math really well or economics really well. And you need to bring in these people that would never otherwise come together. And generally, finding the good mix of the expertise that you need and the personality that you want to work with requires you to look outside of who you can hire. A lot of times it's professors that are so happy being tenured at a university that you need to figure out a way to engage with other third parties to move innovation forward. So as much as collaboration before might have meant, and it's suggestive, like the case studies are suggestive that it meant siloed collaboration, I think what the future requires of us is collaboration across entities where there's an equitable model to help each facet of society. In research, it would usually be the government, academia, and industry, all to play their different roles and get their very disparate objectives and milestones through that. So creating a structure which allows academics to publish papers and maintain their position as a thought leader, allows industry to be competitive and progressively improving, and allows the government to create a more sustainable and improved society for the taxpayer, ultimately can only be achieved if everyone works together. And that is an idea that I hope resonates with some of you, because that's definitely one of the key learnings that we've had. The second one is scalability. So we live in a fairly small province. In terms of population, in major areas of the world, whether you look at provinces or cities, like Calgary is not even in the top 10 most populous cities in the world. Alberta, compared to Ontario and Quebec, does not have nearly the same population. And so what that means is not that that's a handicap for us, but what that means is that we need to use that in framing our problem and how we can contribute to the global ecosystem and the global issue of CO2 emissions effectively. And in my opinion, that requires us to come up with technologies that are not only relevant for Alberta, but have reproducibility and scalability outside of our domain. And there's a lot of thought about, is it important to have social impact with a small venture that improves significantly the life of some people, or is it important to have an incremental invention that affects millions of people. And really, that's a subjective question. Like, some people can argue that one's better and the other's other, but I think the major disruptions that have changed the energy ecosystem to date have done both. They've affected a lot of people in a very significant way. And we'll need many of those to help us bridge the gap that we have between now and 2100 to meet the goals that governments around the world collectively have reached. I'd like to leave with a message of what I think is an important symbol of the industrial age. We think a lot about Edison and the bulb. We think about that not only being the start of the industrial age, like everyone having access to electricity and being able to do things at night, but also just with the overall concept of innovation and disruption. I think that the age that we live in today requires us to come up with a better symbol of what we're faced with. And I think what we're faced with is a burnt-out light bulb. It's a light bulb from the 80s or 90s that's now sitting in a landfill somewhere that we need to do something with today. Because if we can somehow start bridging that gap effectively, and if we can take something like bulbs that's used ubiquitously around the world, now we've reached the scale and the impact that can really turn the tables in terms of the overall behavioral change that we need to start implementing around the world. And so I would say that the modern age requires the burnt light bulb solution, not so much one that can produce light. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you so much.
I wonder if you have checked how much carbon dioxide is going into the food industry through the trees, et cetera, et cetera. Have you actually calculated that amount? Number one. Okay. Have you calculated the amount that we use in the industry to make various products today, like urea? We take carbon dioxide, add it to ammonia, and make urea. We take, in the methanol business, we do similar kinds of things. I'm just wondering if you've looked at that. The last one I want to mention is that, believe it or not, one of the things that how we produce hydrocarbons in the ground is with carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, water, methane, ammonia, etc. And so it goes around in a circle, just like everything else we've got out. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, so I haven't done the math on how much goes into the food industry. What I can tell you is that there is a decent amount of data from global sources that talks about how much CO2 gets utilized. And if you look at that as a percentage of how much we emit, it's less than 0.1%. It's actually much less than 0.1%. So, and I would agree with what you're saying about the use of CO2, especially in things like EOR and other ways that CO2 gets used in producing downstream processes. Covestro just put together a plant in Europe that uses CO2 to make ethylene, for example. So in these instances, there is definitely progress, and I think my intent isn't to say that work isn't happening in that space. I think that needs to be encouraged, and I feel that we're still orders of magnitude off in the scale at which it needs to happen. And so that is an ongoing battle, and I think there's a litany of different examples of what you just shared. I agree with you.
Thank you. Great presentation. I have a question related to the last question. Is using CO2 as an ingredient for other products is a significant way of recycling the CO2 emissions we produce from other activities? Can it make a dent in this emission? And the second part of the question, how do you source the CO2 you use in your products? And does harvesting CO2 from air, does it have like a downside? Like this process, the energy needed to harvest CO2 from the air, does it create more problems, or so the overall output of the process? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question that you asked is a very important policy question. I just concluded last week a program that ran out of Ottawa called the Your Energy Future program that actually had a cohort of 16 people, basically youth from across Canada, asking similar questions. And what you'll find is that the data suggests today that if economic conditions were to change, so if regulatory frameworks were to incentivize the capture of carbon, that there is a significant way of moving the needle on CO2 emissions. In fact, a really good resource to look up is the CCCR, which is the Center for Carbon Capture and Removal in Berkeley in the US. And Noah and his group have proved that, actually it's proven by the IPCC as well, but generally, even if we were to follow on our trajectory and get really good at energy efficiency and using lower sources of carbon for producing energy, we'd still have excess carbon or CO2 in the atmosphere that needs to be removed. So it definitely needs to be done. Whether it can be done at a scale where it does make that required change in moving the needle, it remains to be seen, because some of it is going to be determined on how the policy changes and how technology can adapt. And that's why disruptive technologies that can make an economic case for capturing CO2 at scale are significant. We just met with a couple of agencies here in Alberta where we showed them some of our results in the concrete sector for our company, and we've shown that that can make a significant dent. In fact, to go back to my weight analogy, if our technology in the concrete sector was to be used across Alberta and all the concrete that's produced, we would capture more than the weight of humans in Alberta in terms of CO2 emissions. So from that perspective, and we're not the only ones, I'm not here to toot our horn, I think there's many companies that can make that case, and so it'll be interesting to see if policy catches up. As for your other question, I think it was an excellent question about sources of capture. So as you can imagine, ambient air has about 400 parts per million of CO2, so it's very dilute. What that means is, to get X amount of CO2 out, you'll have to treat 100 times more air to get the CO2 that you actually want. It's like a needle in the haystack, and you're collecting needles. So what's encouraging, though, is that there are point source emissions. There are food processing companies that produce currently, or methanol plants that produce high purity CO2. In fact, over 3 million tons of CO2 in Alberta, the last I checked, is produced at a high concentration of over 90%. That can be siphoned off right away and delivered within a 150 or 200 mile radius. And just to add to that, you asked about where we get our CO2. We get our CO2 from that. So Praxair is a local gas delivery company, and they actually recover that CO2 from a food processing plant or a methanol plant and deliver it to local sources like, stadiums that use that in Coke or whatever else. So I definitely think that at the very beginning, as things stand right now, there's a much more legitimate reason to capture CO2 from these concentrated sources of point source emissions. Having said that, I think what's also interesting to realize about the energy system in general is we don't use the same amount of energy in society through the day. So there are many times of the day, especially up in Manitoba or Quebec or BC, where hydro is a big proponent of the energy system or component of the energy system. There are many non-peak hours where you can actually use that towards energy-intensive ways of capturing CO2 directly from the air. So I do think that ultimately that might be something that happens. That might take decades to come to fruition. But overall, I don't think that the energy system, because this is dynamic and heterogeneous and it's very variable through even on a 24-hour basis, there are many windows of opportunity where even that worst-case scenario of taking 400 ppm, getting it up to 80%, is viable and economically and from a life cycle CO2 basis doable.
Hello. Hi. When I first heard you speak a few years ago, you were using CO2 as the carbon source to produce graphene, and then you were going to use graphene as an additive into asphalt. So I'm not seeing any of that now. I assume you maybe have progressed from that, or maybe you could share some of your learnings, because I thought all of that was going to be quite challenging, and just interested to know where you are on
Where did you see me speak?
I think it was in Edmonton at some event.
Okay. Yeah, because I've never talked about asphalt that much. I've actually tried to stay away from that. But to answer your question, so we do produce nanomaterials, and the reason that I've used that term here instead of graphene is because actually that's been an example of where we've pivoted. So we can make graphene, and we do produce graphene. What we've found is graphene is not always the best solution for what the end user needs. So without getting overly technical here, one of the bridging materials from bulk graphite to graphene is graphitic nanoplatelets, which is kind of this medium step, which is not as fine as graphene, it's not as energy intensive to produce, but it turns out it actually has better performance than graphene in some of the applications that we've sought. And so in that instance, as much as we'd love to create graphene just for a lot of the academic coverage, or researchers saying, oh my goodness, like everyone's funding graphene projects, like give us your graphene. And that has happened, we keep that going. But from a market standpoint, we've tried to focus more on what the market needs. So when they give us a list of criteria for what their pain points are, I can assure you no one ever says we need graphene, like never. They'll tell you they need this performance, this cost, or some other metric, very specific to their use and their pain point. And so we've tried not to get overly, at the inception of the company, we had to play up a lot of these hyped up words because, that's how you get traction. But ultimately, to be sustainable in the marketplace, you have to solve the problem. And so I would say we haven't deviated at all. If anything, we've actually expanded the scope. And it's funny you remember asphalt because I genuinely can't remember when I ever talked about asphalt. I think I might have in a brief moment, but that's definitely not been our focus as a company. So I'd be happy to discuss that bit later with you.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm taking course in sustainable energy development, and then you mentioned that you're using CO2 for making all these different products. My question is, when you make all these products such as plastic composites, or you use it for lining, then does these products have any environmental impact in long term?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how and how easily can these components later on can be degraded? And is there any challenge associated with it?
The answer is not as simple as the question might seem. So it's very nuanced. It depends on what kind of plastic you're talking about and what jurisdiction you're in, what kind of regulations they have around recycling or reuse. But the fact is, so for life cycle emission reductions, generally the protocol around that is you compare how business is done with the adoption of your technology against business as usual. So if you can show that the way this plastic was being used in Alberta or on the West Coast in California or in a state like Louisiana, let's say, how does that compare to how things would be done with the use of your product? And generally, the case that you have to make from a CO2 standpoint, or the case that we've been trying to make and promoting, is that you not only see a CO2 emission reduction because a portion of that plastic composite that you use in a plastic bag for garbage collection or a crate for milk or something, that has a part of CO2 in it because it's using our product, but also it's improving your productivity and making those crates so you're producing 100 of them instead of 70 or 80 in an hour. And so that increase in efficiency versus business as usual has a lower CO2 impact per product produced. And so that is what you compare. And you're exactly right. I think it's for plastics in particular, it tends to be very nuanced because it's a very geographically segregated area. There's over 10 injection molders in Edmonton and Calgary, and there's over 50 in Ontario. And so each one of them will have a different way of regrinding plastics. And what makes it even more complicated is most plastics that you see today are composites in themselves. So they don't just use polyethylene or polypropylene, which can be recycled basically tens of times before it can't be reused again. So in that instance, our product does not change that, which is a good thing. That could have been a hindrance, even though that's not a reason anyone would buy it. But with other plastics, especially for engineered plastics, that is an issue because at the end of life, you can't keep recycling that and regrinding it. So it's a good point, but I think there's very well-established ways. I think what we've seen is not so much that the methodologies around life cycle analysis differ. I think those are fairly well-grounded and they're done well. But the use of them to make a business case can differ. So some companies do an excellent job of covering everything and some not so much. And so you just want to be sure that you capture all the assumptions and build your control big enough to capture the inputs and the outputs. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely what you have to consider is the life cycle.